Okay, welcome to a video on optimizing textures, models, and materials, uh, basically to save memory on the video card and make things more performant. And possibly as a sidelight, you can also, there's a method to save actual memory in your project as well. We'll get into how that works. This is being done in Unreal Engine 4.27. I'm working in 4 because that's where that's what I've been working in. And 5, I have not been able to get to perform the way I want with the same stuff that I'm doing. I do, however, use 5, the 5 versions to do some of the editing on the meshes I'll talk about just a little bit. There's not much in this video. There's a different video for how to edit in Unreal Engine 5 your meshes. So all the stuff we're going to talk about here is in Engine, either 4 or 5, and not you don't need an external program. Although, if you know Blender, good, great, you can do something with that. And it doesn't hurt to have something like Photoshop or another editing program to be able to pull these textures, some of these textures, out of the engine and then load them back in after you've modified them a little bit, or if you want to modify them. So I definitely have done that, and I'll talk about why you would want to do that and what advantages there are. But you don't need it to do the main stuff we're going to talk about here, which will give you the primary benefit of these reductions. All right, so we've got a scene here, although we're not going to get into this too much right now. I'm not going to have this up most of the time. We'll have the other main settings here. So we're working on a couple of models here, and there's also, I'll show you an F-15 fighter here in a minute, so to give an example for textures and whatnot. But just to give a quick explanation on these vehicles are from the Matrix City demo. And the Matrix City demo I had a particular use case for these, and again, all of this stuff is going to depend on your use case, so you're going to take bits and pieces of this to use as you need. I'm not too worried about LOD stuff on these right now. You can sort out your LODs on however you want to do that on your models. I'm dealing more in this case with the overall model, the overall vertices and textures and materials of the model. These models were done as a merge because the Matrix demo models, and this is, by the way, these are from the original Matrix demo. I think the more recent versions of it, or whatever you can download from the store, I went back and tried to re-download it because I'd messed around so much with mine that what I downloaded, I kind of wanted a clean copy of everything. But when I downloaded it, I got the models were much lower resolution, or vertices and whatnot, and they seem to be set that way, and I don't know if that was just a fluke, or I'm not seeing things right, or maybe they're in another place within the project. But the project was much smaller, and it didn't have the higher resolution models. So I'm keeping my original set, so I have the highest resolution models of these. Anywho, that's a sidelight. But if you try to do what I'm doing here with these models, you may end up with different results because they may not be the highest resolution to start with. That's a little sidelight thing, just a little warning in case you try to duplicate this. I have another video also, speaking of this. We're going to talk a little bit about how I did the models on these, but we're just going to gloss over or hit the high points. I have a couple of videos where I delve into editing these city cars to be able to pull them into Unreal Engine 4 from 5 after you do some editing in 5 and merge them and all that stuff and what's involved with that. I'm just going to hit the main things that are going to impact what we do here in this particular video, as opposed to going into any depth on these particular models. But what we got here is we got the car model, which I have reduced the texture to, and to basically get it down to one texture and one material. So this is the material, and these are the textures. And I did that for, again, my use case, because really I'm going to be probably somewhere about this distance and maybe at an angle and above, not really going to be like flat like this to them, or close, because you notice if you get close, because of the way I did this, oops, hang on here, that is not where I want to be. That's material instance. Here we go. If you notice, there's parts missing because I did some editing to pull out stuff that I didn't need, and that wouldn't be seen, because these were going to be destroyed. These are going to be just set pieces. They're not drivable cars or anything like that. And they were going to just be destroyed, or have a destruction thing applied to them. So I took out a lot of stuff. I probably could have taken out more underneath here because they're never going to be seen underneath. Initially, I had them. I used these models, but I went to a different model for the destruction. But you can see there's a bunch of stuff missing here. You can see right through all this stuff, and there's the whole engine's missing and stuff. And that was to save vertices, triangles. Again, in terms of whenever I got these from the marketplace, and when you get a lot of stuff from the marketplace, they're going to be high resolution, high vertices and triangles, high textures, 2K, 4K. And that isn't always necessarily what you want to do and just use them raw like that in your project, because it's very costly. In terms of cost, the textures, each 4K texture is going to be 22 megabytes. You can see right here, this is the one for the jet. We're going to show in a second. That's this one here, right here. So we got a F-15 jet from the Vigilante content, which are very nice models, by the way. So this is 22 megabytes. On disk, this is, well, actually, this might be a little bit smaller. It's a normal. Let's take a look at the, give me 1 second. I just realized I should probably take a look at the, no, that is, okay. Oh, the normal's bigger, yeah. So let me get this over here. So the normal, which is always larger because it's a normal map, it's got an alpha channel, so it's twice the size. Even this shows 10 megabytes. This is the size, 11 megabytes. This is the size it's going to take on the video card. We'll get into this a bit more later. But you can reduce, when you start reducing things, and we'll find out how to do that, you can cut this down a lot. But every 4K texture is going to take 10 megs on your video card. It takes even more on disk. The actual file of this in your project folder on your disk, not just in the memory here, and probably in memory, takes up more than that. But this is what it basically, with the texture compression or whatever the engine does to manage textures, is 11 megabytes per texture. And you could have, in this case we got 4 textures that we're using for this model. So that's 40 megabytes just for this one model of just the textures. So you start doing the math and you start realizing you start putting a lot of stuff in your scene. You start putting dozens or hundreds of objects like this or anything that's got 4K. It's going to add up quick. So back to the car as an example. So what I did for this particular car was I reduced everything down to one texture, or one material, I should say. There and a few textures. The textures, are here, and it's really these 3 right here. So you've got 3 textures that I reduce this all down to, and there's benefits and disadvantages. These cars in particular, they're kind of tricky to work out with reduction because of the strange way, although I see why they did it. They did this in the Matrix demo. You saw how I mentioned that the one 4K texture takes 10 megabytes on the card, right? 11 megabytes. So these cars in the Unreal Engine demo had a instead of a 4K 4096 by 4096 texture, they had something like a 2 or 4K wide by high or wide by 14,000. In a base 2, whatever they did, 14,000 pixels, if you will, size texture. And I think it was like a master texture. It seems to me like it's a master texture that held just all the textures for all the cars. Now, that's a good way to do it, except it's very hard to work with unless you created it, because you can't. I tried to output that texture. I was going to reduce it in Photoshop and say, oh, well, let's just try reducing this texture so I can keep all of the good parts and pieces of the vehicle looking right, but it wouldn't even output. It failed. It just put a 0 byte file out. So I have no way. Maybe I'll try it with a newer engine or something and see if it can go, but I couldn't get it to output that texture in a way, and I don't even know what would happen if I tried to import it, considering that happened. But getting back to the idea of textures, the reason I think they did that is because then they could put one texture, which had to be several hundred megabytes in size. If a 4K texture is 11 megabytes on the video card, something that size that's several times larger has to be hundreds of megabytes, because it's exponential as you go up, as you make the size bigger. But you only need one of them. So all the material references, like if this was the material for it, all these references would come from the same texture in some way. So that would be, maybe that's how they do it. I'm not quite sure. I'm just guessing. But anyway, it caused problems when reducing. So there are compromises, and again, in my video, the other videos on this topic for these vehicles goes into that. There are some compromises doing it that way where not everything comes out right. You can see the tires are really shiny because the hang on a second. Hey, what's going on? That's the wrong one. There we go. The tires look plasticky and very, very shiny. At a distance, it's not so bad. You can kind of get away with it, but at close up, it really looks. It's got a there's no tread texture, and it looks like plastic. And so does the wheel hub, for that matter, a little bit. Works pretty good for the paint, though, the shininess. But and then you get things like the back. These don't look too bad. These are pretty good considering they're supposed to be chrome and with a translucent kind of thing. And sometimes these work and sometimes these don't look very good. But anyway, so there's compromises for this method. But anyway, the other video goes in the method of that. But the reason I did that, and the important salient point here, is because I wanted to get one material, and as few textures as possible. In this case, I've got 3 for all the cars I did that way. I have a base color, metallic, and normal. I need the metallic because, well, it's a metallic car, and you can adjust that. We'll get into that a little bit, I suppose. But you could actually, because you have a metallic, you can actually put a parameter in and adjust that so it's either shiny like this or more flat and matte color, satin or matte kind of color. This gives it a nice metallic, and on gold and silver and some other stuff, it looks nice and chromed, which is kind of cool. Anywho, but this now gets me from whatever that massive texture and material thing they had. Oh, another reason. Sorry, I should actually point this out. So the other reason I want to get this down to one material, and the other reason this is kind of really weirdly compromised, is because the original car, because it had that gigantic texture that it pulled probably all of the various textures from, or maybe it did. Maybe it did have several other textures, but either way, it had the material slots it had like 35 to 45 material slots. And when you're talking performance, that's another massive hit, because your 2 biggest considerations besides texture, you can kind of look at it this way. Start with texture size, the size of the textures you need. Then you go to the material and how many materials you need and how many textures within each material you need. And then you also need to look at the vertices of the car. And we'll do a little bit with this, but not a lot, because this is kind of a different topic. But it still fits within the scope of optimization, even though primarily we're looking at textures and materials. But those are the kind of the 3 areas, primary, that you want to look at for any of your models, and where you can find efficiencies. And like I said, as a sidelight, one of those efficiencies is, if your use case is such that you can edit out portions of the meshes to reduce your initial full quality mesh by as many vertices and triangles as you can, that just works for you in the end. But when it comes to materials, every material creates what's called a draw call, which is, and most of you probably know what that is, but that is when the model is put into the world, or here for that matter, it then has to draw the material onto it. And the more materials, the more times it has to draw on that model to put all those materials on. So again, think of your multiplication effect. If you're doing a racing thing and you've got a dozen cars, maybe you could probably get away with high quality 4K stuff because you only got a few cars and even multiple materials. But if you're, in my case, and in cases like where you might have like a large scene or something you're moving through, and you've got cars and buildings and furniture and all this other stuff, and your characters, that starts to add up real quick. You start getting into 10, 20 materials per anything, and it starts to, then your frame rate's going to plummet. The engine does a pretty good job of that, but at the same time, there's limits on how much it can do at one time. So these are areas of focus that we want to do. So now, how do we go about reducing things in a way that will help? Now, I don't really have this particular example setup is not really set up to show the difference on the video card. Like here we start with a gig of memory used, and then we're going to end up with like 300K or whatever. I don't really have that in this particular case, so you'll just have to kind of use your imagination and get the idea of the reduction, because you can model that. And I'm just not going to do it here because it's too much back and forth, and I want to get to the point of the various parts and pieces. But this should give you a pretty good idea of what you can do. So remember, this this will affect performance, but, well, okay. So materials will affect the memory on the card, because obviously if you have 20 materials, you've got 20 material instances on the card, and then you have, times how many textures. Let's say there's even if there's 3 textures per material, that's now 60 textures if they're unique. If they share, and this is an optimization tip, if the materials share, like the maybe the normal or the metallic, between models, which I do have on this case with this car, then you can gain a lot. So from a material standpoint, in this case we've got, the way I did this was, and I only have the one car for an example, but I do have the various textures and materials. So I made up different colors for the cars so I could swap the materials around. So I can take this black one and I could put it on the car and we get black. And that's a huge advantage because it's the same material instance. So this is, the references here are very, very minimal of what's on each material instance. But I can also do something tricky like, undo that here. Okay. So if we take a look at the material instance, you'll see I got red, base color, which you need because you got to have your colors. But you notice I don't have a normal. And this metallic says black metallic because this metallic works well enough that I don't need this specific red metallic. This, of course, will not be in every case. Certain ones, I think the gold model I have and maybe the white or silver ones had to be unique enough. They had to have their own to really look right. But you could look at something like the white one, the white model, has, and I don't have the car set up. Give me a second here. Put the car on that to make it look a little better. No. There we go. Okay, so the white one has white and white, metallic. And the silver one has silver as a base color and black as a metallic. And I tried black, white, silver, this one looked the best. So you definitely want, when you have something like this, where they're similar or the same, if they're literally the same model, this is the kind of thing you can play around with. And even within that, even if it's not the same, I would say for any given model you pull off the marketplace or create or whatever, you should always try a couple of things. And within these materials, one of them is, and it won't work for this one because you need the metallic, but you take the metallic and just turn it off. Now this one goes nuts because it needs that metallic because it's silver. But, and see that one does too. But sometimes, in some cases, and again, if we take the metallic off, it goes patchy. And again, this is more unique to these types of models than what you would normally find. And then you notice, with the metallics, arm, yeah. So you can see how that changes. But in some cases, they won't change very much. This is especially true of the normal in some cases. So you want to mess around with this stuff a little bit. It's always worth it to try to uncheck categories or take the material out and see what it looks like, because sometimes you can get away with it. So where you can't get away with it, for instance, is something like this model. So if you notice, if I take off the normal, you notice how that changes? It gets very modeled. Let's see if I can get over here. Which if you want a rough looking appearance, I guess you could use. But generally you want it to look nice and clean. So you can see the difference there of how that goes strange. The normal usually carries quite a bit of information on certain things about details. It does depend, though. When you don't have a lot of detail, like on this car, let's go to material. You notice I don't have a normal here. I don't really need it. I could put it on, pop that in and see what it looks like. And it does look different, but it doesn't look significantly different enough because I gain a savings of an entire texture if I don't use it. So for me, that's worth the trade-off. Let's turn that on, and we'll pop that in. So you see, that does look better, but it's not like, it's a little more consistent, because that red, if you look real close, the red without the normal is slightly patchy from certain angles. From certain angles, the red's slightly different from like the fender to the door. So it's just a little bit better, but for me, and for what I'm doing, when I'm going to be distant, if I was close up, I'd probably do it. But at the distances I'm looking at, which is, like something like that, it doesn't really look that much different. So I can get away with not having the normal. So that's a big thing you can do with materials is play around with these, see what you need, see what you don't need, and see if you can reuse one like this from if there's a multiple colors or multiple things within the model. See if you can get away with. I have dozens of cars, and I had to go through all these cars and try all these different things like this with each car. You know, say, okay, let's use black or white or whatever the metallic is for the set on each car and see if it worked. And in most cases it did. In some cases, like you saw in the silver one, it didn't. So that's a big tip right there that can help save an entire material, which is not a bad thing. Now another thing we can get away with is, before we get into the materials too much, or the textures, this is partially texture, partially material, is we go to the, I think I already have it open, material, normal, okay. So here's the normal for the plane, okay? And what we're looking to do here is, this is going to start looking at reducing, where you can reduce, but this is going to combine the raw savings you get with what you can get away with, maybe. Now again, in my case, I'm not this close to the plane. I'm out here somewhere, generally, a little bit further away. So, so starting on how you reduce these textures. So what you do with reducing the textures is, I wouldn't mess with this power of 2 mode unless for some reason this is not both power of 2. If you've got a weird imbalance like 512 by 1024, or well, not even that really, more like if it's 500, if each number is not a power of 2, let's put it that way, you can do this, but I've had weird results, so be careful if you mess with setting that power of 2. In cases like that where you have an odd texture that doesn't follow the rules and is an odd number that's not a power of 2, I might leave it alone and not try to reduce it, or take it out into Photoshop, make it into a power of 2 that way, and then not use this, because this can do some weird things. It doesn't really work very well, I've found. But what we can do is we can go to, oops, that's not it. Oh, it's where is it here? Oh, there we go. I just didn't have this opened up. So make sure you open this up here in the top part. So what we're looking for here is maximum texture size. Okay, now what's important to remember here is, okay, so we have a 4K texture. This is a normal. Uses 22 megabytes on the card if we don't change it. In the actual file on disk, the source file for this in your project, this is going to be more like 50 megabytes or something like that. We'll get into that in a minute. That's where the Photoshop thing can come in handy, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, about why you might want to actually change the base texture and re-import it and use it that way. But for now, what we're dealing with here is in-engine. So we're in-engine. We got a 4K texture that uses 22 megabytes on the card. So you can change this value, let's say 256. Well, let's try something a little bit more. 2048. You got to know these numbers. As long as you know the power of 2 numbers, you can just type them in. So it's, 256, 512, 1024, 2048. You got to double each time, or half. So if you do 2048, now it takes 5.5 megabytes. So that's so just reducing it down one step, because you will go from 4,000 to 2,000, basically 4,096 to 2048, half. You gain fourfold power of 2, right? So this is what you want to keep in mind as you're doing things like this. So we go back to the plane. Let's get a little closer so we can kind of see the details here. Also, by the way, you may have to manually go back and flip that, because sometimes this does not really, this or Control Z doesn't always undo some of these. I don't know why. Sometimes it won't undo the texture that you change. Sometimes it won't do the certain changes. So you got to be careful about what you do. But if it works, you can take a look at this. And also, let's see here, another little bug in the program. When I'm about to hit Control Z to undo it back to its full size, so you can see the difference. But this window is not necessarily real time. It may actually look strange, and you'll have to move it slightly to have it update. So when I undo this, it won't necessarily look exact. It might not look exactly right. It won't instantly flip. We may have to move this a little bit. So you'll probably want to, when you're watching this, maybe use the back arrow if you want to compare to before and after. So just to reset us here, we are on 2048, and we're going to flip it back. Oops, I gotta get the right. We're going to flip it back to the 4K, and then see about moving and see what that looks like. Wait, actually. Okay, see how that kind of changed a little bit? But then we're going to flip back, because now we're flipping back to 4K. Okay. So you can see there is a difference, Now if we try to redo, go back to 2K. So you can see we're on 2K. There's a difference, but it's not super, even at this range, it's not super high, it's not really that drastically different. So you can sometimes get away with less. Now this is in the normal. It's going to be less, well, let's say this. Let's try this. Sometimes you can get away with a lot less. I often do things down to maybe 1K or even 256 or 512. Sometimes you can go pretty far down on the normal, depending on how much the normal is used and in what way on the model, and it can still look pretty good. Again, for my purposes, I'm somewhere at, let's see, more like something like this kind of a distance. But even up close, even fairly up close, you can see, so we're at 256 right now on the normal. We're going to go back to the 2K. And again, you can see it fill in a bit, and it definitely looks a little bit better, but it's not like radically different. So that's 2K. But if you'll notice, if we did 256, well, now we're at 85 kilobytes compared to 5 megabytes, compared to 11 megabytes. This is the dramatic difference you can make depending on the model, and where you have to do a lot of experimentation, because you have to kind of check each texture to see which one has the most effect. Now, this will have a definite effect. This will have a much more noticeable effect going down the stages. So, for instance, let's do let's get it opened up here. Let's do one down. Okay, and you'll see, because it's not a normal, it went from like whatever down to 2.7 megabytes, which is not too bad for a 2K texture. So, but that level of detail, but that detail on the texture you will definitely notice more so when you start going down than the normal or possibly the metallic. And it depends on the model. It depends on what they've put into it and how it's made. But it's a trick you can use to really super optimize your textures. I've had all those cars and even some of these models. Most of this model, for what I use, I go down to the base texture is 512, and the rest are either 128 or 256. So I'm using maybe 100 kilobytes for all the textures for this plane instead of 20 or 30 megabytes. Huge savings in performance and memory. Well, I don't know performance so much, but memory for sure. So we're going to go ahead. So right now we are at on the main. This is the main texture, the base color texture, what you call it. We're at 2K. So we're going to undo that back to 4K. And again, definitely more detail, but depending on what you can live with, and what you need. Now, everything I'm talking about here is optimizing really more for games. Not so much for, trying to do, because you're not really going to do this kind of stuff when you're trying to do, like a movie or scenes from something like that, or cutscenes or whatever. You probably want highest quality on those. But for gameplay, for performance, frame rate, and memory, this is what's going to get you pretty far. So we can pull this down. Now, like I said, I run mine on this particular plane at 512. And you can see, definitely a difference. But at any distance, it still looks pretty good. From even right about here, that's pretty solid. I mean, it doesn't look too bad. Again, if you want super, super high-end, AAA quality games, and you don't mind, the frame rate suffering, you can definitely jack that up. But for most of what I'm going to be doing, especially for this is mostly a set piece, and I have a couple of flyable planes where they fly, this thing in motion, if we're flying, let's say you're doing a flyby, you do something like this, you can't really, that doesn't look bad at all, it looks fine, It's only when you kind of are close up and you linger that you can maybe see, but even then, there's a certain idea that has to do with perception. And that has to do with, if you don't have something to compare it to, a given thing can look whatever like it looks like. Now, obviously, there are limits to that. You can't go down too far. If we went down to 128, it's going to look like a blurry mess. Yeah, so that doesn't look good at all, obviously. But there's a certain threshold, and you may want to experiment. Like, let's do 1K, so 1024 on this. That can look pretty solid, you know? And if this is the only thing you're presented with, or this level of detail in the game, your eyes will kind of perceive that a certain way and adjust to it. It's only when you compare back to back directly, or if you had something that looked like the previous one that looked all smeary and blurry, and then you had another one that looks super sharp, you know, two different objects in the scene, one looks really, really high quality, super sharp, the other one looks really, really blurry, then yeah, your mind is going to say, hey, this doesn't look right. But if they're both of about equal quality and above a certain threshold where they look pretty good, your mind is going to perceive that as looking good, and it's going to actually fill in a little more detail than what is actually there. This is a trick that game designers use to get more out of these textures without having to necessarily run, you know, huge textures. They kind of take that perception and utilize that to give, you know, again, you got to get above a certain visual quality threshold. It has to look pretty good to begin with, or else you're not gonna. But once you start looking at it, you're at this level. This is a 512, 256. No, sorry, this is 1024. So your mind is going to start saying, you know, details that maybe aren't really there, or it's going to say, hey, that looks pretty good. So this is a perception thing that you have to be aware of when you're designing. You get above that quality threshold, and you can kind of work within that. Okay, so a couple more wrinkles to this. So with the alpha textures, okay, I don't know if this one would work. I'm going to put this up a little bit just so we can see a little bit better quality on what I'm trying to do here on the alpha. Maybe I'll put it to 2000 because I want to play with another setting that I don't want it to be too biased against. So one other thing you can play with on a lot of alphas, you notice how the alpha is 5 megabytes, and at the same scale this one is, well, it's not now, but, well, wait a minute, yeah, this one's like 2.5 megabytes, 2.7. The alphas are always larger because you have, well, because of how alpha works. There's an alpha channel in here, and that takes up as much space. But sometimes you can compress without alpha and put this to default. Okay? Now, you got to be careful because it can really mess things up, and you got to, even sometimes putting these back doesn't work. So if it this is where this little glitch in the system is. Remember I said that sometimes when you change those, you don't see it here in the mesh until you move it? I did this once and it messed it up really badly, and I'm like, oh no, and then I moved it and it snapped it back to, like, it updated basically to the current, the settings that were in here. But just as a test, we can do compress without alpha and go to default. So now, if you notice, it doesn't look too bad. You can do back-to-back comparisons to see, again, if this is suitable for you or not, or if you get any weird anomalies. But if it looks good, that's another trick you can use, a very good trick, could save a ton of memory, because many of the alphas that come with these things do not need, the normals that come with these assets do not need the alpha channels. You'll have to kind of look the model over carefully and make sure you didn't miss something where an alpha channel would actually have some effect. But like this one, for instance, is not really, I don't really see anything. So that is another big trick you can use to dramatically save things. Because in many cases, like something like this plane, you're not going to get away without the alpha channel. It's really not going to work. So you need something. But if you can do a combination of a reduction of the resolution of the alpha channel and this setting, these settings, to turn off alpha and compress it as a normal texture, again, you can save quite a bit of space. So now instead of 5.5 megabytes, we're at 2.7 megabytes. And then if we do, like I was saying, we can go to 256 on this one. So now you can see that still looks pretty good. And again, you'll have to do comparisons to see this versus the larger way and where the thresholds are. But to me, this looks pretty good. We're even pretty close here. If we're back out here, that's perfectly fine by me, you know. And again, the reduction in savings, we're down to 43 kilobytes used on the card, on the video card, instead of megabytes or even hundreds of kilobytes. So this is where you want to be focusing on these textures, materials, and seeing how you can get reductions down, way down, to see if you can affect that. Similarly, let's put this. We'll leave that there. We'll leave these here. Let's try something. Let's take a look at the arm. This may or may not work so good. It can depend. But similarly, you can do reductions. Actually, I think I did do a reduction pretty heavily on this. We're going to put this down to 256 as well. Now, metallic can mess things up if it uses it a lot, so you got to be careful. But again, doesn't look too bad. So now, if you remember, 4K textures, 11 megabytes. The alpha, 22 megabytes. Okay? This one uses 4. It uses the metallic, the base color, the emissive, which I haven't changed, and the which is really just these little lights here. So at the moment, I'm not going to really deal with that. You can deal with that as you see fit, and you could just turn those off, and then they just go off, or whatever lights go off. Those sorts of things you can play with the same way. But I've done this already with this. I've reduced this down as well quite a bit. So and then the normal. So we reduce this down, the D channel, which we can, in my case, I can go to 512 for what I want to do. That looks pretty good still. Now let's do let's do 1K, because 1K should look pretty good. So just to do some math here to give you an idea. So 1K on the main texture. The normal is 43 kilobytes, and the metallic is 43 kilobytes, and the emissive would also be either 43 or 84 or something like that. But we're talking about 683 kilobytes plus 40 plus 40 plus 40. So about 800 kilobytes from 40 megabytes, because again, each one of these would have taken 11, 11, 11, 22. Actually, it's more like 50. 22, 33, 44, 55. So this would have taken about 55 megabytes at full 4K res, 4K settings, and we've reduced that down to 800 kilobytes. And it still looks pretty good. Again, your use case may vary depending on what you need to do, but I mean, I think most people would agree that that is a pretty good looking plane anyway. Now, it's a little rough here, and that may be, again, you may play with the normal and stuff like that. You may want it cleaner than that. You can play with those settings to get it more clean and whatever else is going on there, because some of this might be down to the normal, some of that might be down to the textures, the main textures, but you know, that's a decent looking model for 800 kilobytes of textures. Now, it should be pointed out, this is another important aspect to consider, some of your considerations. This is going to take a little bit of mental thinking to understand, so try to follow, and I'll try to be as clear as I can. When you reduce this down, this is only internal to the engine, okay? This is the original. You can see how this says imported 4K. That's because the source file is still 4K. This is still 4K. It's a 4K texture. The engine is still dealing with this as a 4K texture, period, at its core, at its base, right? And any of these reductions are done at the time that it's loaded onto the video card. What it's doing is it's saying, okay, we're reducing to 256, we're compressing it to get this maximum size here, and then we're sticking that result onto the video card for this texture. The source file is left alone. The source file on your disk and the source file in the project. You are not permanently changing because you can always go right back to 4096. So you can freely use this method to move around or to change and experiment with the sizes you want to use. And that's a really powerful thing, because then you're getting all the benefit performance-wise on your card, but you still have all the flexibility you need to change it at any time you want. And you always are starting with, because you always want to start with the highest quality of whatever you're working with. You can always reduce down. So for instance, you can, and this is kind of part of what we're talking about here, we're not going to get we're not going to get into this too much. We're not going to get into the LODs. You can sort out LODs, scaling yourself and how many you want. Right now I'm just running one, so just one standard LOD, and I let the engine just take care of it from there. But for what I need to do, just auto. But you can set your LODs up however you wish. But when we're talking about reductions here, if you'll notice, and let me get the let me get the thing here. So what we got here is two things here. So I got two versions of this car. Let me get it here. Got the red one, full scale, from what I exported from when I did my editing and my conversion and everything. 397,000 vertices, 385 triangles. This one is reduced, and it's reduced. You can see about a third, or to about a third, about 2/3 reduction. It's quite a good reduction. This is done in Engine, and that's the same idea as the textures exactly, except for meshes, which is where you go in here and you find, where is it? Here we go, reduction settings. Reduction settings. I usually do triangles. You can do vertices. You can do any, whichever way works best. And you give it a percentage. And I think I did like 35% on that one or something like that. And this will take a minute to calculate, and it will give you a result. I make a duplicate so I have the full size, because you can always go back on this, but I find it easier to have just the source car in full so I can just duplicate it if I want to make a reduction or something like that. But this is also in Engine. The source file is left alone. You can always go back to 100%. So you can go back and forth and you can play around with it all you want. Now, to give you an example of what that looks like, at 1/3, that's where we get this. And what you can see from, again, I'm at a distance of something like this. To my eyes, I mean, maybe if you jack the resolution, I'm on a 4K monitor here, so maybe, but I can't tell enough of a difference to justify 2/3 larger of a triangle's vertices. This one, but if you get close, you can definitely see where it's doing its savings. You can see the corners start to get a little whatever. And again, you can play around with LODs on this stuff if you want, and whichever way you want to do that. But for me, I just wanted one set. I just wanted one model at a certain size. And this is a fairly complex model, so it's definitely... And you can see it does weird things like this. Things don't always go quite right. And the reduction, you have to find a happy medium of where curves work enough and surfaces work right. But for the most part, and I'm only going to touch on this part of it, just this much. I'm not really going to delve too much into this part, because you can play around with this. But it does the same exact thing. You can do your modeling however you like. You can take it out of, Unreal Engine, or start in Blender and bring it back in, whichever way you want. But in Engine, this is one way, quick way, to be able to modify things and get a result that you can use in Engine without messing around with anything and without changing the source. So that's all very important to know. Now, the last thing is, I just said that these things don't modify the source. There are instances where you may want to. Like I said, in my case, when I was doing this airplane, I'm going to go back here and set these back to where I use them. So for my project, I was using 512 on that, 256, and 256. Some of these I even went down to 128. But this is good enough for example. So okay, so I'm looking at things from this perspective here. So I know 512K, 512 I should say, 512 on my main textures, and whatever works well enough. So in this case, what I did was, and I've got an example not for the plane though, but for the car. What I did was I went through and reduced them down to either 1K textures or 512 textures, 512 by 512 or 1024 by 1024. I find going to 1024 is a little bit better, but the reason for that is because my project just got huge. Because I have hundreds of these, well, maybe several dozen, maybe like 50 or 60 vehicles, and, well, all the vehicles. It might be like 100. Anyway, it's a lot of vehicles. And I looked at this, and I was like, the source file, like I said, a 4,000 by 4,000 source file is going to be like 50 megabytes. So that starts to add up a lot when you have just all these textures all over the place for, at least three per vehicle, and probably 5 or 6 in some cases. Some of them, just as a little aside here, some of the textures, like this glass, were already 512. Like this is the source for I haven't modified these. So this is the source for the F-15. 4K on the main textures, but this is only 512. So I didn't mess with these. Anything under 2K, anything under 2000, I keep saying 2K, but anything under 2048 I didn't redo, because at 2048 it's like 2 megabytes, or it's like 4 or 5 megabytes or something. It's a few megabytes. and it wasn't enough to mess with for the tediousness of doing this, because it was very tedious to go through and you had to export all of these, take them into Photoshop or batch them in Photoshop, reduce them in size, put them in a folder, and then bring them back in, which is what this folder represents. So this is all of them re-imported. I was experimenting initially with 512, reducing them to 512 versus reducing them to 1K, and whatever size, you can just pick whatever size you want, but there is an advantage to going even from 4K to 2K, 4096 to 2048, because it'll be 1/4 the size on disk. So in your project folder, you'll be getting a huge, I had like gigabytes of reduction. And the reason for that, I do that, and I did it this way, is because I know that there are ways to do versioning and all this other stuff, but I have found, personal preference, it is easier for me to just periodically, after I do a session of programming, back up the entire project folder. If you back up the entire project folder and something goes wrong, and something later goes wrong, you can always restore back that. You can just delete your original, or not your original, but where your main folder sits, and you can just put everything back from the backup. I put them into a RAR file, and so you can just take everything, put it back into the folder, load it, and you can go back to where you were. So I have decided not to mess around with this versioning stuff and the other methods, and just, it seems simpler and faster and more easily for me to understand to just back up my entire project. So because I'm doing that, one of my projects is 90 gigabytes, or it was actually about 110 at one point. And when I did this reduction, I got down to 87. So, or maybe even 79. I got down to like right around 80 at one point. So I'd save like 20 or 30 gigabytes by reducing the textures I knew I was not going to need at 4K down to something smaller and replacing them. So I got them in here, tested them, and then I deleted the source ones. In this case, I didn't, because these are just cars, but so I didn't really delete these, and they're small enough anyway. But some of these cars, this is a 1K, 1024, but some of the cars I imported that I did these material things are 4K, and of course everything having to do with these vigilante vehicles are 4K, and a number of other things too. So that's one use case for how you might want to, or why you might want to actually export your textures, reduce them down, re-import them, put them into all the materials they need to be put into, and then and you can further reduce them from there. I did 1024 because, again, I can always go down, right? In a couple cases, I did 2048 because they needed it. They need, you really needed a little higher resolution on those, but most of them I was able to get down to 1024, and that's a relatively small file on disk. Still gives me the quality I need, and I can always go down from there, because a lot of them I did go down on. The normals and the metallics I went down further anyway, rather than try to match them exactly to where I, like, oh, I'm going to use 128. Well, okay, but I don't want to put it at 128, in Photoshop, because if I decide that later on I want something a little bit better, or I can expend the resources, and something isn't quite looking right, I can go back up to a certain level. And of course I kept the source files as well, so I can always redo them from there if I need to. But within the project, like I said, that's what I wanted to do, was to reduce the file size of the project, because as I start backing up the project, you start backing up 80, 90, 100 gigabytes with any kind of regularity, and it eats up hard drive space real fast. Also, and I'm not entirely certain about this, but I believe it's true, and if anybody can confirm that or knows about it, that would be great. But I believe the other wrinkle to this is that when you reduce these down like this, when you package the project, I believe it only packages the smaller version. I don't think it packages the full-size version, or whatever the largest size is. If you were to do some kind of dynamic material, I haven't messed with that at all, where you change it programmatically, you change this if you can, the texture size. I'm not sure if you can, but if you can, I haven't messed with any of that, so I don't know about that. But when I did this and I did a package, my package size was like a couple gigabytes, or like a gigabyte smaller. It went from something like 5 gigs to 4 gigs or something like that. So I believe that that's the case. I could be wrong, and maybe it doesn't work that way. But either way, these methods are well worth doing, because either way, in the end, you're going to get 43 kilobytes for this texture on the card, which is a huge savings. And I was able to run this on a 2 gigabyte card from 10 years ago. at full frame rate, or well, whatever the frame rate that thing could do, but it wasn't choking because it wasn't swapping textures across the PCI bus onto the card, So it was running as good as it could because everything fit. So that's a big thing. Not that you need to necessarily, program for 10-year-old cards, but it's always a good barometer to test on older equipment just to see where you're at. Because the better it works on older equipment, the better it's it's going to be fine on the newer stuff. So anyway, that's pretty much my presentation for this. It took me a long time and like a couple of months of experimenting, testing. This is kind of the stuff that I discovered through all my experimentations. There are probably other things you can do, and I would love to know about them. There are probably many more things you can do for performance, but this was stuff that seemed to have a direct, immediate, tangible impact on not only performance and video card memory, but also, in the case of swapping my textures out, project size. So I had a number of benefits off of this as I was playing around with it. And then you start going, hey, I wonder if you could do this, and I wonder if I could do that. And sure enough, I was able to figure out some things that way too. And what you've seen presented here. So this is some of the stuff I've discovered and I want to share. And I thought that there really wasn't much of an in-depth video about how this stuff works and what your benefits are and what you can do, and some things like the tips, like saying, hey, look at the normals and take out the alpha if you don't need it, or hey, you can reduce normals and metallic way down, possibly, and get really good results. These things can make a huge difference, but I don't really know anybody talking about them that way or going into that kind of detail. So I really want to document this stuff out, what I discovered, and try to get some information to people that might be able to use it, and hopefully it helps everybody. So that is all for now, and thank you, and we'll see you on the next one.